Recording in progress. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for zero point 0.1 ASHA CEU. If you're joining us for this live episode and your state license requires live CEUs, please be sure to complete all course modules, including the one that says complete course before the end of the day on your Speech Therapy PD account. Here are the disclosures. Laura Langer receives a salary from the Parkinson Voice Project and has no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. I am the owner and founder of BrainBridge Connect LLC, and I do receive financial reimbursement from Speech Therapy PD for this and other presentations. I am the secretary and president-elect of the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be written in the chat or the Q&A and will be answered throughout or at the end of the presentation. Now we welcome our guest, Laura Langer, MS, CCC-SLP, who serves as the Chief Clinical and Research Officer at Parkinson Voice Project, where she's committed to advancing evidence-based care for individuals with Parkinson's disease. She has an extensive background in medical speech-language pathology and clinical education with a strong focus on neurologic communication and swallowing disorders. Laura previously served as the lead clinician for the New York State Speak Out Therapy and Research Center at the University at Buffalo, where she played a key role in program development, clinical training and research, and expanding access to specialized care. She's deeply committed to advancing innovative, accessible treatment approaches that improve speech and swallowing outcomes for people living with Parkinson's. Laura, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Renee. It's my pleasure being here.
Good, good. So I typically start out by asking our guests how they came to the field of speech language pathology because I find that um, people's stories are so interesting. Anyway, it's one of the things I love most about the podcast, but I think it gives the listeners kind of a glimpse into your why and like why this is important to you.
Renee, I love talking about that. I work with graduate students for so long too, and it's interesting to hear what the why is behind how people get into this field. So for me, I always knew that I wanted to help people. I just wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that at first. And so funny enough, I changed my major a couple of times and landed in special education and started taking those courses, and it wasn't quite right. I knew it wasn't quite the right fit. I ended up transferring colleges, and as I was looking through the list of majors going to the next college, lo and behold, in alphabetical order, the thing that comes after special education was speech language pathology. And I thought, oh, that sounds like helping people too. And it just so happened at the time I said, I'm going to do that, and hopefully it works out. And when I transferred schools, I had a full course load of speech classes that year, and I loved every single one. I knew within the first few weeks that this was the right choice. And then funny enough, when I was probably a freshman in high school, we had to take aptitude tests, and I probably looked at it and forgot about it. And years later, after I was in the field, the top 3 professions that were listed on that aptitude test, one of them was speech language pathology. So
Wow.
I guess if I had paid more attention to that aptitude test, perhaps I would have gotten into speech pathology a little bit sooner than I did. But that is how it got started. And I think, like a lot of students coming into college, initially I thought I'd work with children. I always imagined speech pathologists working with children. I was a kid that had speech therapy in first grade for my S's. So that's just what I had in mind. And then it wasn't until I got to my medical externship, I was placed in a hospital, which I was really looking forward to. But again, the first few weeks that I was there working with my mentor, I said, oh my goodness, this is for me. And I kind of went down that path, and I can't say I never looked back, because I've done a lot of different things in my career. But it's just something that I've really loved, and I feel lucky to have landed in it the way that I have.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, this is my second career, so for me it was a weird pathway that of like I thought I was going to be an orthodontist, and then I was like, oh, that's a lot of school. Speech pathology, also a lot of school. Not as much money, but a lot of school. So it's interesting when we connect and kind of hear how those seeds got planted, because some people really feel strongly that they knew what they were going to do. Like they had this thing and like they were in middle school and went to a career thing at school or whatever. And it's always just really cool to hear the story. So thank you for sharing that with us.
No problem. Yeah, it's always fascinating to me as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have similar career paths because I've spent my entire career in the medical speech language pathology side of things, working with adults in a variety of settings. And so it's just it's so interesting to connect over the Parkinson Voice Project and just Parkinson's in and of itself, because there's so many people that really specialize solely in that. And so for me, working mostly with neurological disorders in acute care and in inpatient rehab and outpatient, I couldn't only do the one thing, but it's something that I've always really enjoyed working with the patients. They're just so always so interesting to me. Typically, the families are very supportive. Um, and so it's kind of full circle because one of my first Parkinson's patients was my orthodontist when I was a kid. And the first thing he said to me when I smiled at him and introduced myself, because I was married then, so my last name was different, and I'm sure he had thousands of patients, was, "You have a beautiful smile." And I thought, all thanks to you, buddy. So it's kind of cool.
Oh, that
Um,
is cool. Yeah, it
yeah,
comes
but
full
like,
circle.
yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Life is so full circle. But speaking of Speak Out, and the Parkinson Voice Project, this is something that I am certified in as well, and I really, really, I'm not getting paid by anyone, just so everyone knows. I just really love the program. I think it's just um, the structure of it for the patient, the way that it's presented to clinicians is so easy to get your head around it, and for at least for me, and to really embrace it. And so now that you all are doing the pay it forward for the clinicians and not just for the patients has really, really been incredible. I've seen some really incredible stories online. So, um, big shout out to you all for doing that because I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, Parkinson Voice Project. I mean, they've been doing the pay it forward model since 2008 and running their clinic that way. And it really is, it's truly a unique and novel way to do things. And it's so patient forward. And it's just such an act of generosity and a principle of reciprocal giving. And it just, it's amazing to hear the stories from patients. I think back to when I started, and like you, Renee, I mean, I worked in hospitals, I worked in nursing homes, home health care, you name it. And so I've seen people with Parkinson's ever since the beginning, and how things have changed, right? And I remember, of course, for many years before I was Speak Out certified, I did LSVT. I was LSVT certified. I had a private practice for a while with that. But before that, I remember, even though we knew these things, I remember having a mentor work with me and say, well, for people with Parkinson's, they're going to get worn out very quickly. This was probably the early 2000s. They're going to get worn out. So, we don't want to work them too hard. We don't really want to like engage in any sort of exercise type activity. Might as well not really do much of anything. And I remember thinking, oh, I don't know about this, right? And doing some research on that. And so, for some people, that was a way of thinking at some point, that our folks with Parkinson's, they were just going to get fatigued. And
Hmm.
so it's been, truly, truly eye-opening over these, 25 years of practice, and kind of slowly as time goes on, specializing more and more and more in Parkinson's, so that, the last 5 years, that's the only population I've seen as well, Parkinson's and people with related disorders that have come through for our Speak Out therapy program. So again, it's been really eye-opening, and to see those principles of motor learning in action, and to see the progress, like the true progress that can be made in a neurodegenerative condition, and that progress can be maintained over time, it's amazing, it's eye-opening, and it never ceases to amaze me.
Me too. So that gets us into the nitty-gritty, if you will. So talk to us about what the growing evidence is that speaks to the effectiveness of the Speak Out therapy program. Um, and I have a kind of a follow-up question with that. So I'll let you get started with the research end of things, and like what is the evidence that says this is working?
And that's the goal, right? Is to have that really robust, fantastic evidence that we want to see. We have so much anecdotal evidence and peer-reviewed research as well. But when you hear, patients talk about the successes that they're experiencing, we want to replicate that in our clinical research. And, it's funny, years ago, I got to see Jerry Logeman. She came when I was working at Buffalo State University. She came to speak, which was just super lucky to be able to see her and meet with her. And, I'll never forget, because she said, we can never discount anecdotal evidence. And so, again, though, we want to see that research coming out of our Speak Out therapy and research centers. And so back in 2023, Parkinson Voice Project launched its campaign to reach America, which is a grant program for universities to apply to become Speak Out therapy and research centers. And so, that was a step that I took at the University at Buffalo to get involved and to become the New York State Speak Out therapy and research center. And so, coming on board in 2023 with that inaugural group of universities was really cool, because I've gotten to see all the research that has started from those universities from the ground up, basically. And so, right now there are a lot of studies taking place. Some of them have to do just with, Speak Out in general, and looking at all those areas like vocal intensity, intonation, speech intelligibility, rate of speech. We're seeing a lot of studies like that, but it's also running the gamut, which is really cool. We're starting to see the research just starting to seep out. We have several centers that are looking very directly at swallowing function, not just with patient reports, but we have centers that are engaging in modified barium swallow studies, in fees, looking at those instrumental studies to see what actual changes are happening pre and post Speak Out therapy. So we're super excited to see that. We have a center that's looking very closely at effects with DBS. Again, not widely studied at this time, so we're looking forward to that information as well. And of course, you got me at a good time, because the ASHA announcements came out last week. So we have our Florida Center, Kelly Gorajek from the University of South Florida. She's got a presentation coming up at ASHA looking at effects of Speak Out with and without EMST involved. Okay. So they've been doing a lot of that work in Florida, which is really neat. And then Kent State University out of Ohio, Aaron Kolinich has a poster presentation also that was accepted at ASHA. So we're looking forward to that. I had a talk that was accepted also about looking at global impact on Speak Out, the Speak Out program, and how it's impacting people across the globe, because we're putting together a program that can target the rate of expansion of Parkinson's. It's the fastest growing neurological disease on the planet. So there's a huge need there. What we're really excited about too is back in 2017, Allison Behrman from Lehman College started a big Speak Out study. And so they looked at vocal intensity, intonation across 6 weeks and then up to 1 year. And so at that time, they were what was found from that study at 1 year is that those effects were maintained over a year. And so beyond that, she was going to start the study to look at the 2-year mark to see how effects were maintained over the course of 2 years. And then COVID hit, and then that put, threw a wrench into those plans. And so we had all that data, though, Parkinson Voice Project. That data had been sitting there. And so one of our centers at the University at Utah, Brett Myers, undertook this project over the past year to look at that data at 2 years and then to go back to those patients who are still completing Speak Out here at year 7. And so Brett has presented on this a couple times already this year. We're looking forward to his research article being published. But what's truly amazing is that over the course of 7 years, which is the longest longitudinal dysarthria study that we have around, shows that not only do patients in Speak Out maintain vocal intensity and intonation, but those areas have gotten better in patients. It's actually improved over the course of 7 years, which is kind of shocking. I don't know that anybody really expected that to improve over 7 years. One area that did decline when he looked at that over 7 years is voice-related quality of life. Though interestingly, those numbers declined a little bit. And, Brett has some hypotheses about that, maybe just with general aging in some of those folks over the course of 7 years, maybe just quality of life in general has decreased. But, he hypothesizes that maybe because they're so engaged in Speak Out that their awareness improves. So maybe awareness of their voice, right, has improved. That sensory mismatch is not quite as mismatched as it used to be. And maybe that's why they're rating themselves a little bit lower on the voice-related quality of life scales. But no, we're really excited for the 7-year study for those results to be published so that everybody can read about that. And it's very exciting.
Yeah, it is very exciting. And like I mentioned at the beginning, what I found with my patients that kind of their buy-in wasn't there at the beginning. A lot of times they were like, my voice is what it is, or my speech is what it is, or my wife says she can't hear me, but she has a hearing problem. All the things we hear when we work with patients with Parkinson's. They kind of have this whole scripted almost. It's almost like a script because every single patient I think I've ever had, but maybe one, said the same thing. Was they blamed it on their spouse. It wasn't as important because they weren't maybe working anymore, or there's always like this whole thing. And then when they see after the first 1 or 2 sessions, they're like, oh, wow. Especially when you're showing them on the decibel meter where they're at, and they're like, oh, I got that much better in 1 session. And I love joking with patients because I just find it opens up so many doors, but it gives them such a comfort level of, I'm a human being too. And so they kind of warm up to that. But I would say things like, yeah, I'm really good or something like that is like an icebreaker. And patients tend to respond really well to that sense of humor. But I find that by and large, the thing that they really, really stick with, because they're seeing changes in themselves, is the home practice. So what can you talk us through the components of the program that are different, and what kind of sets it apart from other things? Like you mentioned LSVT. I've seen LSVT. I never got certified in that myself, but I think it's certainly, Speak Out is certainly different than LSVT, and there's some components of it that really do um, set it apart because it's based in motor learning, like you mentioned before.
And I think I'm in a unique position where I can do that too. I've done both for like a good chunk of time each. So with Speak Out though, what we show patients and what, if you're an SLP who's watching this and you're a certified Speak Out provider, certainly you're well aware of the circle of intent. And so the circle of intent is a visual, and it's super helpful. It shows patients, especially who are new to the program, that this is a lifelong journey, a lifelong commitment. We often say at Parkinson Voice Project that we're in it with you for the long haul, and the circle of intent is supposed to show that because it never ends. It's a circle. And so we start off obviously with an evaluation. What's a little bit different are these other elements to the circle of intent. And what they do, they help to solidify patient education and that
Mhm.
understanding of what's happening in therapy. And it's done in a really explainable way. And so the What is Parkinson's video. So that's a video that's posted on our website. It's mandatory. We ask all our patients to watch. I shouldn't say we ask. We tell our patients they must watch it with their care partner, their family, their friend, whoever they would like to get involved with that. It's so helpful for family members to have an understanding of what it means to speak with intent and what it does. And so, it's funny, we have live webinars at PVP too. So here's my plug, I guess. We have one tomorrow, but tomorrow's topic is on this. We're talking about treating the system and not the symptoms. And
Mhm.
so really getting down to changing speech from an automatic act to an intentional act. And when we're doing that, we're engaging in, neuroplastic change. I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's what the What is Parkinson's video explains in an understandable way to patients and their families. So that's one part that's a little bit different maybe than other typical therapy programs. Our patients who are candidates for Speak Out, they have individual therapy 2 times a week for 4 weeks for a total of 8 visits. With Speak Out, we always say there's a little bit of flexibility there. We understand insurance, Medicare limitations. And so, for SLPs that need to work, in that frequency and duration a little bit, we can always give some guidance with that too. We understand sometimes that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility. Maybe you need to tie on a few extra visits depending on the progress of that patient and how ready they are to transition into weekly Speak Out classes. So the weekly Speak Out classes would be the next part of that. And that is something that has been novel to the Speak Out therapy program, and so very important. Before I get too far along though, daily home practice is
Yeah.
equally important. And, from what we can see, in fact, from the 7-year study that Brett has presented on, he talks about that home practice and particularly that attendance in weekly classes, that the patients who attend religiously every week for their Speak Out classes, those are the patients in the study who were getting those gains in vocal intensity and intonation overall. So we know that maintenance part is, the bread and butter, along with the daily home practice. So those things are embedded into the program. They're both on the circle of intent. And then beyond the weekly classes, we have patients come back to us every 6 to 12 months or so. They could always come sooner
Mhm.
if they need to, but for refreshers are just essentially a reevaluation. And so during a refresher session, we always say it's good to schedule at least 2 or 3 refreshers. I know sometimes, we see someone for a reeval, they seem like they're doing well, and we say, okay, we'll see you again in a year or 6 months. But it's really important if anyone's watching who does speak out regularly. Those educational sessions are really important. Having patients rewatch that What is Parkinson's video has been so helpful for patients too. So to keep that in mind, to re-educate them about Speak Out e-library, home practice sessions that are online, all those are resources that patients can use via our pay it forward model at PVP, that they can access that off the website. And so sometimes having those periodic educational type therapy sessions along with speak out therapy is really helpful at those refresher times.
Yeah, I call it the tune up. I always tell my patients it's a tune up. You'll probably see me again in usually I'll say 3 to 6 months, just depending, of course, every patient's a little different. Um, but again, it's just another way to make it more practical, make it more um, palatable, I guess, for the everyday patient who, they like to laugh. People like to have humor. When you're going through something, it's not just Parkinson's patients, but patients who are going through something that's so profoundly impacted their life. If you can make a joke or you can inject humor in a way that's respectful but it's funny, and they love patients love that for the most part. Um, and I think it's so nice and refreshing to have that level of rapport with a patient so that there's a lot of trust that we get placed in us to help them. But if you're going in and you're robotic and you're not approaching the patient and saying, hey, this is what you look like today, but we're going to be done in 4 weeks. Maybe in 3 months, we need to revisit this. So we'll go ahead and set that appointment now. And I think when I talked to Samantha, she was very adamant about that as well, like explaining as a clinician that this is not a one size fits all and it's not a one time done deal. This is something that you need to be mindful of for the rest of your life. You have Parkinson's and you're going to need refresher and tune-ups and things like that. So I think that's super important because when you're engaging those motor learning principles, you do see those positive outcomes. So what are some of those positive outcomes you all have seen? I know you mentioned a lot of studies that are coming out, and I'll be in ASHA, so I'm excited to possibly see you. I've got 2 talks that got accepted, so yay.
Congrats.
Thanks. You too. But yeah, I'll be on the lookout for that because I think it's just important to keep up with obviously with the research and see what the research says about those outcomes and what those look like.
For sure. And at what's really interesting too, some of our centers, and when I was at the University at Buffalo, we had an intersite collaboration, intersite study going on with Northeastern. And so that's what's really cool about having the Speak Out Therapy and Research Centers also, is that those centers can collaborate. They can even collaborate with universities who aren't centers but are doing speak out research. I hear from universities all the time that aren't a center, but they're engaging in research. And so it's really great to be able to have those collaborations to increase those participant pools for research. What's really neat too is to get graduate students involved in clinical research, and I mean they love it. They they seem to love it. I think they love it. But no, I've seen that, and it's just really neat. I had a graduate student last year present a poster at ASHA, and it was just a great sense of pride for her. She did an amazing job. And beyond that, it's also a way to have undergraduates involved also. I would often have undergraduate students ask about how they could volunteer with the Speak Out program. we would have patients come in person, individual, or in speak out classes, but also on Zoom. So for the undergraduate students, that was a perfect time for them to come in, be the greeter at the door, help people with their chairs, or, whatever it might end up being. Or sometimes there was office work that we had, filing, those are perfect jobs for undergraduate students. So anyway, it's been a really cool experience to see, not only have, my own Speak Out Therapy and Research Center in New York, and now being a bigger part of it at Parkinson Voice Project, but to see how other colleges and universities, what they're doing with their Speak Out Therapy and Research Centers. It's been really neat to see. And like I said, particularly with this research that is really starting to bloom, we're going to be seeing a lot of these studies coming out. The one thing that's also really neat, and I know you mentioned Dr. Richard Zrake, he's so knowledgeable about health literacy and also care partners. And so several of our centers are studying care partner involvement, the effect of Parkinson's on care partners, and then also the effect of, what Speak Out therapy does for care partners also. So, really, really interesting and new types of clinical research. But yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, and I love that you're going back to what you were saying about the undergraduate students, because I was on our state board for a number of years, and now being on the Communication Disorders Foundation, um, it's always so interesting to see how people, particularly like for me, it started as a student. It started as a student for me, volunteerism when I was much, much younger, high school, middle school. But then when I became a professional, I started volunteering as a graduate student. But what you said was so powerful, because people have this notion of volunteering for a state organization or for a nonprofit or for, like our Communication Disorders Foundation. They think that it has to be this grand thing. They don't understand that micro volunteerism is so important, and it's super important for engaging our students early on, because those students then get invested and they come back and they want to be leaders in various roles, because we've engaged them at this level of anybody can do this. You don't have to be the president of an organization. You can be a student and an undergraduate, and you're interested, so you want to learn more. You can be the person who points to where your student poster contest is at your state conference, or like you mentioned, having them just be there as the door greeter or whatever the volunteer role is. The engagement level there is so important, because it also instills confidence. And I love talking about students, and not just our graduate students, but I taught at the undergrad level for 10 years. And so engaging those students, getting them involved early on is so important, because it gives them not only this confidence, but they go in and they have a little bit more knowledge maybe of what clinically this looks like when they start to work in the graduate level clinic. And so I think it's really cool that a lot of our university programs are starting more to engage undergraduate students, and not just assuming maybe they're not going to go to graduate school, or getting them engaged earlier on and seeing, where does your interest lie? How can we capitalize on that for your clinical experience? Because again, if you're integrating this Speak Out therapy program in structured clinical training and that hands-on experience for students, that's huge. So can you talk to us about um, how those programs are we talked a little bit about graduate programs, but how are you also engaging those undergraduate students? Is it more of like a clinic? I know there's some university programs that mentor a undergraduate student with a graduate student clinician. Is it something along those lines, or something completely different?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I think I'll tell you some of the things that I did at the University at Buffalo. I remember I started college almost 30 years ago. And so where I went, I graduated from SUNY Fredonia. Our clinical experiences started my junior year of undergrad. So that doesn't happen anymore. But what that
In
did,
Australia, as in Australia.
yeah, okay, it does there. Um, yeah, here that doesn't happen anymore. And so students are not getting really true hands-on clinical experiences until they're in graduate school. And for some of them, not all of them, and thankfully just a few of them, sometimes they get into graduate school and realize, maybe this isn't, quite what I thought it was, or it's not quite the right fit. And, some of that comes from not having those earlier clinical experiences. So, from my point of view, getting undergraduates into the clinic as much as possible is only going to help them. It's going to help your clinical program or help someone else's clinical program if those students end up there. And so, like I said, I had a program, I called it the Speak Out Student Ambassador Program. And so they had a special application where they would apply, for different duties. And again, for the ones that were able to come in person and sit in our weekly Speak Out classes, they were involved, not clinically, but they were able to observe and talk to patients. Things, the effects of COVID are just huge, and they continue. I remember sitting in, university-wide meetings and, someone saying, we're going to see the effects of COVID over the next 15 years. And so, some of those effects have to do with some of the social communication aspects. And so, and Renee, I know you taught in university for many years too. So, and many
Yeah,
people watching understand, the needs of a graduate student and what competencies need to be in place. And some of those revolve around social language, pragmatic language, and a little of that was lost during those COVID years. And so
100%. Yeah.
yeah, so for a lot of these students, I think the sooner we can give them these opportunities where they have some hands-on, even if it's just making conversation with some of our patients, I think that's just a huge, huge opportunity for them. And like I think you called it micro volunteering, Renee.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
like hearing that. Yeah. Even those opportunities, it might be micro for us, but for them, it really gives them a foot in the door.
Yeah.
So
Plant a seed.
I had, so our New York State Speak Out Therapy and Research Center is now Buffalo State University, and they had a really fantastic idea. I was just speaking to them last month about, what do we do for patients who truly don't really have a care partner that can remind them to and encourage them to do the daily home practice. And so they were trying to, their idea was to get undergrads involved as Parkinson's pals, who
Oh,
would
that's
be the, yeah, be the reminder. They would help remind patients and educate them a little bit, how to access those materials in the e-library, how to access the home practice sessions, to give a phone call as a reminder, how's it going? Is there anything we can help you with? Deliver a message to the treating clinician. So I think there's just so many ways that we can engage students. And then when it just comes down to our regular graduate students, what I have found with working with them in a university clinic is that Speak Out gives them a really well-rounded way to work with patients. If they're doing the entirety of the program, they're getting evaluation, they're getting individual therapy, they're getting that group element of the weekly Speak Out classes, they're getting reevaluations in, and they're learning a whole lot about patient education and engaging care partners and family members. So, I mean, it's just such a well-rounded experience for graduate students. Yeah, I can't say enough about it.
Well, and you hit on really three things for me. One is undergraduate. So I taught clinical observations for undergraduate students. And so you having engaged or these programs engaging the undergraduate students, even if they're observing, it's still developing clinical skills because they're starting to discern, okay, this is what that looks like. Because I think that was such a hard concept to connect. We've learned all these knowledge-based courses, and now how do I apply that clinically? Um, and then the other part of that is with graduate student, I remember grad school being like, we had to make all of our therapy materials for the most part. And then I got out into the field and I was actually kind of mad because I was like, you had all this crap all along and you didn't tell us. Like I thought I had to make everything up. But, in hindsight now, it made me a better clinician because I can literally do therapy from a piece of paper on, a piece of mail out of your mailbox. We can make that work. So it's
Yes, that
fine. But then going back to the education piece, and I've said this on the podcast probably 8,000 times. I'm such a proponent for clinical education and um, really educating the care partners and the patient because 9 times out of 10, by the time they got to me, if I wasn't in acute care when I was an outpatient, for example, by the time they got to me an outpatient, they might have gotten their diagnosis a year or two ago. And um, sometimes they've never heard the word dysarthria. They certainly most of the time have not heard hypokinetic dysarthria. And so they have been sort of schooled that this is just a voice problem. And it's been like this whole like left out pieces of information that if they had had that sooner, maybe they would have gotten help sooner, therapy sooner, been in the system sooner, been, followed up with sooner so that your outcome is stronger and better. But it's so frustrating to me when clinicians or physicians don't take the time to give that education because it's so important for people to know as a patient and a care partner what they're dealing with. What's it called? What does that mean? What are some symptoms that maybe I don't have now, but maybe I could have later? Or I'm having these symptoms and no one's ever said to me this is a natural part of the disease process because that's the scary part. Think about if any of you listening have ever had a health condition or a health concern, the worst part is all the questions you have, all the scary parts of, oh my gosh, I don't know what this is. I don't know what that means. What happens next? I don't know what to ask my provider. And all of those things are so, so important. So I love, love that about this program is integrating that piece of education that says this is what this is called and this is how I'm going to help you. And these are the components of what we know works and what we can do to lay this foundation for you to have a better life and a longer um, positive outcome versus Samantha and I had this conversation and saying that, when I first came into the field, every now and then I would have a patient with Parkinson's who hadn't had consistent therapy and they were NPO and on a feeding tube at the end of life. We very rarely see that anymore. Most of our patients now are still eating, they're still communicating, even if they know that, this is probably going to be the end of their life, they are still able to do these things and say to their family members, I love you, or, remember to feed the dog or whatever it is, which is starkly different from 20 years ago.
Yes, Renee, that's a huge difference. And, I found the same thing. And I just had the conversation with someone last week about that too, especially coming from, years ago working in skilled nursing facilities and seeing patients with Parkinson's at the end of life. And you're absolutely right. We're not seeing that anymore. And, and this, speak out as an exercise based program and really truly changing what is automatic to changing to the intentional motor pathway is what helps with that. And so, historically, like when I started out too, we would say things like, slow down, be louder, over articulate. take
Yeah.
take a big breath
Do
and
diaphragmatic
up and
breathing.
right, yes, diaphragmatic breathing. Go up and down with your intonation, right? And we'd, bark, 7 or 8 different verbal cues during the course of a session. And so, what we've been talking a lot about in our clinic, we've been doing a lot of internal training. We're working. For next year, we're going to have an operations manual for our clinicians, and so that there's something, very tangible that our clinicians can take with them to say, I'm doing the Speak Out therapy program, and this is how I do it. And one of those concepts is, again, treating the system, not the symptom, because that's what we know works. And so, in my research about this, I was looking at some broader Parkinson's motor rehabilitation research, and that's what we know across the board, is that the basal ganglia is damaged, and that is our automatic functions travel through that basal ganglia, relies very heavily on dopamine, and that's why things that are automatic, like speech, swallowing, facial expression, handwriting, walking, arm swing, those things that are automatic and are people with Parkinson's are so impacted. And so what Speak Out does, and it's the only speech therapy program for people with Parkinson's that does this, is to change the motor pathway and to change it to the intentional system and to make it, come from the cortex, right, instead of that basal ganglia. And in doing that, we're tapping into that intentional motor system, being very consciously controlled, and that's what we know works. And we know that it works across PD rehabilitation literature. And that's what we're doing with Speak Out.
Well, I think just again, going back to the students and having them involved, what are some ways students are being involved in the clinical research part, so that they are prepping sort of for more of that medical clinical practice when they graduate? Because, we have a lot of great programs and we have a lot of um, great engagement where students are able to connect with patients, but then how does that translate beyond just that graduate clinical program part? Because I know when I came out as a CF, I'm like, I have all this knowledge and I have some pretty good inherent like clinical skills that you can't be taught, but then also still feeling like, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing. When I graduated and went into my CF, like, oh goodness sakes, how do I do this? How do I implement this? And so let me rephrase my question. What ways are these programs engaging students in that clinical research aspect so that they do have a little bit more readiness? Maybe not competence, a little, maybe a little bit more confidence, because I think those are the two things that people get like they mix up confidence and competence, and those are two very different things.
Yes, and that's the ultimate goal when you're working with graduate students, especially for those of us who come from a medical setting and we understand. If you've worked in acute care and you've worked in rehab or a SNF, wherever, you understand the nuance, you understand, all those competencies that are essential. And not only that, that self-awareness
Hmm.
that a new clinician needs as well, to know what you know, to know what you don't know, to know when to ask ask questions, to be confident, but not to be overly confident, right? And
Yeah.
there's a delicate balance there. And so, if you're a clinical supervisor, especially coming from the medical background, we're trying to obtain as many wonderful medical clinical rotations for our students as possible that you can get in that setting. And that can be tough sometimes in a university clinic. I know there are some clinics that are way more medically based. There are others not so much. There's some that meet in the middle there. And so if you're a university clinic that has a speak out therapy program, it's a really nice way for students to get those experiences that are so needed, especially for those who want medical externships, who want medical clinical fellowships and beyond. It's a good program for that. In terms of the clinical research, every semester I'd have a new batch of students on my speak out team. So they would take the course. We know there's a student training course on the Parkinson Voice Project website, and they take it, and it's wonderful, but you can't just throw the students in from that. There's usually a couple weeks worth of orientation on the clinical end of things. But if you're a university that's engaging in research too, students need to be city trained. They need to be oriented on the research data collection protocols. But in doing all that, it gives them a leg up. Even if they're students, or they will be clinicians that never get into research, it really is helpful for them to understand that data tracking, data collection, getting participants permission to engage in research, reading through information with patients, answering questions they might have, inputting research, there's a lot of elements to it. So if you're a university that's interested in clinical research, I think it's a really great way for students to obtain those experiences. I know, like I said, working with my graduate students in New York, it was really helpful for them.
Well, and I think a lot of programs too and maybe I'm confused. I don't think I am, but I've heard a lot of people say that a lot of universities have moved away from doing thesis. And maybe some even with capstones, they're only doing capstones for doctoral level students at some universities. And so for me, I did a research-based thesis, and so I was able to do a lot that all the things you mentioned, um, the data analysis, learning how to graph the data in a multitude of ways, comparing it to older things, and what I found in my research, and so that was so helpful when I went into um, discerning research just as a clinician, because and I think and I say that to say for your students who are involved in these programs, people often don't realize that not every study is a good study. Not every study is a well-designed study. You can get published in a variety of places that doesn't necessarily vet or um, care what your study. I mean, I hate to say that but it's true, and I think it's pretty well known. There's a lot we have a lot of really great resources, like SpeechBite out of Australia, where they're vetting the research for you. Um, the Informed SLP is another one that does some really good vetting of the research. But having the students learn this is what a research study, how it's comprised, how you evaluate this data, how you translate that data into positive outcomes, or in the case where it's not a positive outcome, just an outcome in general, I think is super important because we're talking a lot about Parkinson's in the research, but this whole just basis of the research in general and how to interpret that data is really, really important as a clinician when you're going into the field. Um, and looking at evidence-based practice and making sure that what you're reading is valid, it's the gold standard of what we're looking for. And so I think that is a really, really great component too, because for those of us in the medical spaces, I feel like 9 times out of 10 in acute care, especially, it was like a boxing match. I was constantly having to defend with certain physicians what I was doing, why I was doing it, why I was advocating, why I was engaging the care partner, making sure they had the education piece that they needed. And there were just, and I worked with a lot of great physicians, don't get me wrong, but there were always like one or two that was like, yes, I do know what I'm talking about. Yes, I do spend a lot of time reading through this research and making sure what I'm doing is correct and making sure, that we're trying to get the best outcome for the patient. So I think that's just such an important part of that clinical process for students moving into the field. So thank you for being a part of that.
No, that was a great question, Renee.
We have a little bit of time left, but we do have quite a few comments and a couple of questions.
Mhm.
Let's go back here. So one person asked, how does one get certified? So I'm assuming you're talking about for Speak Out.
Yeah, so for Speak Out certification, if you visit our website at parkinsonvoiceproject.org, you'll see a box at the top that says Speak Out Training. SLPs and SLPAs can take the regular full 13-hour Speak Out course, and then there's a student training course also.
Oh, thank you too for mentioning SLPAs. I should have mentioned that too, that was available for SLPAs. And the same person said, I wish fantastic to engage undergrads early on. The opportunities are available. This is true. I wish I would have had more clinical experience in college. And then we had another question. How does Speak Out contrast generally or specifically with LSVT?
So I think, some of the big things come in the logistics. So I talked about the circle of intent earlier, the daily home practice. And so in Speak Out, it's mandatory. We are we are, the mentality of being a coach sometimes with the people that we work with
Yeah.
Parkinson's. But daily home practice 2 times a day while they're going through the individual therapy those first 4 weeks, and then that transitions to once per day for the rest of your life, and then weekly Speak Out classes. So those are two elements that is very specifically prescribed in the Speak Out therapy program. That's a huge difference. And then the third big difference is, again, that Speak Out is targeting the entirety of the motor system and not just one of the symptoms.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things to note is that there's, a cognitive element that's also built in to each practice. And then one of the things that I found really helpful, because I did the first iteration, well, one of the first iterations of the program where we had the cards, the conversation cards. And that for me and the patient both, that was super helpful because it kind of took the pressure off almost, if you will, of like the patients after a while, they like the protocol. Most patients really like that routine of doing, the exercises, but they also really like the conversational aspect because they want to share. They want to, a lot of my patients were retired or at least, pretty close to geriatric age of 65 and older. And so a lot of them, and not all of them, but a lot of them were not maybe socializing quite as much as before. And so they really love that aspect of being able to come in and say, what's something you did when you were younger that maybe you don't do as much now. And I got the coolest responses, like I used to cook dinner for my family every night, so I took a cooking class on how to make authentic Chinese food or something. It was just like all kinds of stuff. Or I learned how to play mahjong because my wife liked it, or it's just all kinds of stuff. And it was so much fun to hear. I had one Parkinson patient who lived in South Africa and taught there as an older white gentleman, and he would talk about his experiences a lot with living in the South African um, country and the experiences he had from everything from having a pool at his house that he never thought he would have to seeing animals like just like going to work and there's a giraffe. Just all kinds of stuff. So it's so cool to hear all these stories from patients. But a couple more questions.
Mhm.
Have you found that Medicare is covering the 4-week, 8-session Speak Out protocol after a patient has already had LSVT? And are the classes then offered online for free?
So that can be different. And, I was just talking to someone not just a few weeks ago, actually, who was in that exact predicament, and they were putting in for more visits. So, I'm not sure what the outcome was for that particular person. I mean, the best you can do is to try to put it in and see if it comes back. And the second part to that question again, Renee, was
Are the classes then offered online free? Are you talking about the patients classes? Are you talking about clinicians or both? The speak out classes.
yeah, so each certified speak out provider can provide weekly speak out classes. Some people who work in outpatient and are limited perhaps, by insurance, Medicare, we encourage everybody we tell you that our speak out classes need to be free for patients. And so we understand sometimes employers, directors of rehab are sometimes reluctant to do that. So if you take our course, we'll give you talking points. We have a marketing materials page to help you advocate for
Yeah.
free weekly speak out classes in your facility. But, we understand that if you can't do that in your facility, there are other providers who offer weekly speak out classes, and many of them are virtual. They are classes, they're not therapy. And so we always encourage as best practice, go local. Go
Hmm.
local if you can. If you have a speak out therapy and research center in your state, start with them. However, if you need to find a class for your patient, you can go outside your state because it's a class and it's
You're
not
not billing for it.
considered therapy. So if you're a speak out provider and you're struggling with that question, always feel free to contact us at our education inbox.
Well, and a lot of like I know our local APDA chapter, there's several different we have a huge Parkinson community where I live, in different cities have different support groups that also help connect you to those resources too. Is there research being conducted at the University of Arizona in Tucson?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Um, and then this is a good one. I got this one recently from another clinician. Will PVP ever consider bringing back the option of free printed booklets versus just the ebook? Just thinking about reaching patients that are in rural areas with limited internet access.
Yes, and this is a question that we've had, and
Mhm.
the decisions. Samantha Ellendary is our CEO and founder,
Yeah.
and she's always future thinking. We're always thinking to the future at PVP, and in thinking about accessing therapy materials, the e-library has not just that Speak Out booklet, but it has all the flashcards, which, as you were
Mhm.
just talking about that, Renee. I mean, those are so important for carryover, and we're often updating those therapy materials. And so if you're accessing the e-library on the website, you're ensuring that you're getting the most up-to-date therapy materials. And then here's the other part to this. Like I said before, Parkinson's is the most rapidly growing neurological condition on the planet. Some estimates right now globally estimate about roughly 10 million people globally with
Mhm.
Parkinson's right now. So, I mean, there's no distribution center that could send out that many booklets globally. And that's part of thinking about the equity of access and whatnot. And we run a clinic. We have a PVP clinic in Texas. We have well over 500 patients, and so we're doing it. We're doing it in our clinic. We're getting patients on the e-library, even those that are out, in rural areas. We're working with care partners, family members. They do it on the phone sometimes. If they can't get on the computer, they can get on the phone with their daughter who lives in California that can get into the e-library, and do those exercises over the phone. So we're making it work. And again, really forward thinking here about the access to therapy materials, the entirety of therapy materials for our patients.
All right. And so we have time for one more. Is there any research that addresses targeting patients that were diagnosed a long time ago? And what's the best window of opportunity to pick up a Parkinson's patient in a skilled nursing facility?
Good question. And, I was at World Parkinson Congress. The thing that came up over and over again, early intervention, early intervention. And, since then I've been trying to actually do the lit review on that. And there's not a lot that's, pointedly telling us that early intervention is key, but yet, you look left, you look right, and that seems to be the case. And I was talking to a movement disorders specialist who also has Parkinson's. And when I asked, when do you think neurologists are referring and movement disorder specialists are referring for speech and swallowing, his answer was just way too late. They're all referring way, 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 way too late. So to answer your question, again, I would, if there's even mild, mild difficulties, mild dysarthria, mild symptoms of a swallowing disorder, of dysphagia at this point, again, early intervention. The earlier we can start, the better.
Yeah. Well, Laura, thank you. Thank you so much. Again, I really am a big fan of the program, and I just found that my patients have had good success and really, really engage with it. So really, really thank you for agreeing to be on here and to talk about the research specifically and the way that you're engaging students is fantastic. So again, I appreciate you being on with us, and you're welcome back anytime you would like.
Oh, thanks, Renee. I really appreciate you having me on. And yeah, you have a wonderful podcast here. This is really awesome. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Just as a reminder, if you've joined us for this live episode and your state license requires live CEUs, be sure to complete all course modules, including the one that says complete course before the end of the day on your Speech Therapy PD account. And Laura, thank you again.